So rolling what, take two. So what I'll do is I'll say 5, 4, 3, and then you start.
Okay.
So 5, 4, 3.
Hello, my name is Craig Warren Smith. Thank you for joining us. Please stay with me while I take you on a journey about closing the digital divide. This journey begins with the big picture of the circumstance we are facing on this planet in the 21st century. I read a book once that maybe you know about this book. It's called The Future by Al Gore. And in this book, Gore writes that there's 6 problems that are emerging in the world. Global warming, we all know that Al Gore is associated with global warming, but there's also the problem of terrorism, possibility of nuclear war. There's the problem of the acceleration of the gap between rich and poor and the concentration of wealth at the top of the economy. Just 8 people own wealth equal to half the world's population. There's the problem of overpopulation, and there's the problem that corporations, global corporations, have bought each other up, so there's only a few corporations that are shaping the direction of the global economy. All those are problems that will cause the global economy to crash by the year 2050. And at that time, it won't be possible for the Earth for humanity to continue to function on this Earth. There will be such interpenetrating problems that humanity's legacy will end at that point. So this is the first real concise analysis of the dystopia that's facing the planet that I ever have read. It was in 2006 by Al Gore. Now, one thing that Al Gore did say is that there's only one factor that could alter this dismal scenario that will cause civilization to crash. And that one factor, he said, is that we need to change the future of the internet so that the internet becomes a factor for restoring balance to the planet. The internet becomes a factor for restoring balance to the planet. And yet, when you look at the spread of the internet internationally, you can see that the internet is a culprit that helps to explain why all of these 6 problems have become worse. So Al Gore says that, well, the way we fix these problems is to make the internet function in a different way. So essentially, this is the problem that I want to talk to you about. I've been working on the problem of the digital divide. That means the gap between those people able to benefit by the internet and those who are not. And I've come up with a strategy that I'd like to tell you about. It's called meaningful broadband. Meaningful broadband is a framework, a model for altering the shape and direction and impact of the internet as it spreads into the developing world, where 3.5 billion people are not yet connected to the internet, and about 4.5 billion people are not connected to broadband internet. So the issue that I want to speak to you about is how we alter the internet to restore balance to the planet and allow civilization to continue.
Okay, so the camera is rolling, and 5, 4, 3.
Up till now, the market forces that are shaping the direction of the internet have not been altered much by governments. So in the United States, for example, we've had certain companies like Microsoft, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple rise to the top of the pack, and these several companies have solidified their power and developed stock valuations of up to $1 trillion. and they are in a position to essentially secure their dominance as a kind of oligopoly over internet markets. At the same time, we have a similar process going on in China, aided by the Chinese government, where a same group of companies are mirroring the strategies of those other 5 American companies, and soon they will meet head to head. So I believe that the opportunity for altering the shape of the internet lies in the developing nations outside the US and China, as those two forces, commercial forces of China and the United States, meet head on and interact with local governments in order to secure their role in bringing another 3 billion people onto broadband internet.
All right, so I am rolling. So 5, 4, 3.
So currently, the American companies that are on the top of the pyramid in terms of the internet economy have been able to secure their position because they have taken advantage of the deregulation of the internet, the deregulation in telecommunications that allows the strong to survive and the weak to fail. In China, certain companies have risen to the top through their making a deal with the Chinese government to give Chinese government the ability to censor data and to shape the direction of these companies in ways that serve China's interests. So you have 2 groupings of companies that now look forward to securing another 3 or 3.5 billion humans onto their platforms. And these 2 groups of companies are meeting in neutral territory, like in India, like in, say, Indonesia, the 4th largest country. So I would like to explain how, by this new encounter between business and government in these developing nations, particularly those in Asia, we can begin to break apart the monopolies and the what we could call digital colonialism that is affecting the world, and cause the internet companies to give up a tremendous amount of control in order to win favor from host governments in various nations that will control how the next 3 billion people embrace the internet. I've been looking for what I could call a test nation, a test market nation, what you could call a proof of concept nation that would show that a really different, qualitatively different shape of the internet is possible. And there's certain conditions that need to be met for one nation to serve as a pivot point that will drive this transformational change of the internet. And I've selected Indonesia as the country that I would choose as the optimal country to demonstrate a new way that the internet could reverse the imbalances and inequalities that we spoke of earlier. So I've been working as an advisor to the Indonesian government for the last 10 years. I began as a professor of science and technology at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And while I was in my perch at Harvard, I realized that I was teaching the best and the brightest youngsters from all over the world, but I wasn't actually in a position to help those young people guide their nations in the development of the internet. I had to find one country. And you could say that the future of the internet relies very much on certain swing states. You know, in the US election, we have swing states. Some states are predictably Democratic or Republican, red or blue, and only a few of them, perhaps 13 states, are in a position to swing the election one way or the other. Well, the same is true with the global internet economy. Only certain nations have the ability to actually swing the internet into a different direction. And Indonesia certainly is one of those. Why? Well, number one, because of its scale. It has about 290 million people. That makes it the fourth most populous nation in the world. Beyond this is it's largely an Islamic nation, though it isn't officially Islamic, and its innovations could well percolate through to the Middle East, where it could pave the way for a kind of Islamic embrace of the internet as that region, the region of the Middle East, moves away from the oil-based economy towards a more entrepreneurial, digitally based economy. So Indonesia is pivotal in terms of pointing the way for the other parts of the Muslim world. That's one factor. And in the next video, I'll tell you about the others.
So I'm rolling. 5, 4, 3.
So the internet could be shaped by the swing states that are large enough to bend the internet in a new direction. As I was saying, the Indonesia, as the fourth largest nation, has the scale to potentially attract the attention of the Chinese and the American companies and cause them to bend their policies and practices to be able to be approved platforms for the Indonesian middle class as the populace rises into greater wealth based on their use of the internet. Beyond it being a really large nation, Indonesia is demographically sufficiently uniform to be able to arise at once into broadband use. Unlike India, that has 30 languages and 400 million people in absolute poverty, Indonesia is basically a country in what's called the lower middle class. It is just below the price points that allow them to arise into a solid middle class. It wouldn't take much for the internet to interact with the citizens to create a massive middle class of 300 million people in a few years. So there's a certain kind of uniformity in Indonesia. They're largely lower middle class. They're making about, $15 a day at least. And not only that, but they all speak one language. Unlike India, where you have 30 different languages, official languages, in Indonesia, there's one national language, Bahasa Indonesia. Everybody has their local language, but all education is in that one language. So you can have national policies that are spread through one language coming from Jakarta into the regions. And beyond this, Indonesia truly is a democratic country that is committed to open systems. Unlike China, which is committed to closed government-controlled systems, there's room to create a balance and interaction between public and private sectors that bring the insights of the latest innovations in Silicon Valley, such as artificial intelligence and so forth, into the shaping of the direction of the Indonesian internet economy. So beyond this, Indonesia has the leadership that I think is required to achieve a massive transformation of the internet. There's somebody who I got to know a decade ago. His name is Ilham Habibie. He's the eldest son of B.J. Habibie, a former president of Indonesia, and the hand-picked successor of Suharto, which was a kind of strong man, a recent leader of Indonesia. Habibie has been my partner in Indonesia in bringing a concept called meaningful broadband to the nation. So in the rest of the video series here, I would like to explain how meaningful broadband is going to work and is working in Indonesia, and what it could mean for you, for me, and for the planet.
Okay, and I'm rolling, and 5, 4, 3.
So Indonesia has become a test case for closing the digital divide. Now, how's this going to work? Well, we have to recognize that even though Jakarta is a coherent capital city of Indonesia that is able to drive policies through the rest of the nation, Jakarta has to share power with regional government units at the base of the economy. There's 500 local units that we're called regions or regencies, because historically they've been sultanates. They've been, led by sultans and other kind of royal courts and so forth in Indonesian history. Today they're called kabupaten or regions. I have developed relations with the Indonesian government to establish 7 of these 500 regions as test cases for meaningful broadband. And they're spread all the way from the west side, Sumatra, all the way to the right side, Kalimantan, covering 7 time zones of the Indonesian archipelago. So we tried to select 7 test market regions that are typical of the other 500 regions. So if we can get meaningful broadband to function in each of those regions, we can tell the government in Jakarta what they need to do to spread the internet meaningfully through all the regions in the nation. And again, these regional government units are outside the big cities. This is where about 3/4 of the population reside, and this is where the majority of the population is in this lower middle class segment, which could be easily upgraded into a solid middle class.
Oh dear. Okay, I am rolling, and did I plug everything in? Yes. 5, 4, 3.
Hello again. So what is meaningful broadband, and what does it mean to introduce this concept to a country like Indonesia? Well, it's taken us several years to formulate a definition of meaningful broadband. We're talking about spreading ecosystems of products and services that work together to create meaningful impacts on citizens. Now, what is meaningful impact? Well, we're talking about affecting the lifestyles of the end user, the consumer, so that their lifestyle becomes, their use of the internet becomes usable, affordable, and empowering. So we're not talking about promoting internet addiction. We're not talking about promoting wealth concentration. We're not talking about promoting pornography or other kinds of low-end uses of the internet, such as gaming. We're deliberately focusing on ethical uses of the internet that have empowering impacts. Now, empowerment could be seen as a very subjective factor, but what we now know is that through neuroscience, we can study what the addicted brain looks like someone who's addicted to video games, their brain is shaped in a certain way, and someone who, let's say, is a deep meditator, and Dalai Lama's students, they have another kind of brain where the parts of the brain that are normally in conflict with each other become aligned, and the individual becomes empowered. Now, this is not to say that we're promoting Buddhist meditation in this Islamic country. But we can use biometric technologies to measure whether an end user is addicted or not as a result of their use of a particular technology. So we're talking about internet for a purpose. We know we need fast video level access that enables interactive learning between the consumers and the governments, but we need to create a form of learning that is not addictive but empowering, and that is supportive to the cultures that are in the countryside, so that we're not talking about ripping consumers away from rural villages that have cultivated ethical values for thousands of years and putting them into the traffic jams of Jakarta. We're talking about somehow creating a new kind of economy that enables Indonesia's 90,000 villages to be strengthened by e-commerce and by internet-based jobs, remote jobs that allow the young people to return from the city into the countryside where they can join their families in the villages and create this new kind of wealth economy at the bottom up. So that's what we mean by an ethically based approach to the internet. So when we talk about laying cable for fiber optics, or we talk about establishing cell towers for mobile internet, the key question that is being asked in Indonesia is, in promoting the infrastructure that enables broadband into a certain part of the country, can this be done in order to serve the purpose that brings the benefits of the internet, that is the empowerment factor of the internet, to the low-income people? So that's the crucial difference between meaningful broadband and some other government-sponsored effort to just bring broadband for everyone. We're talking about a test market case where we can see that it's possible to deliver the empowering benefits of the internet to the people on a test market basis. Once we see that this can work in our 7 test market locations, we will then have the ability to spread out to 500 different regional locations, producing a bottom-up approach to the internet that is totally different from the commercial internet that begins in Jakarta and that trickles down to the bottom, creating addiction at the bottom. So that's what we mean by meaningful broadband. I want to say that our strategies for bringing meaningful broadband to the country meant that we had to win over support by a number of stakeholders in government, academia, and in business. They all had to understand that meaningful broadband could lift all boats. We're not talking about a highly regulated internet. We're talking about one that simply breaks through what's called the lower middle class trap that excludes the majority population in the lower middle class by bringing a number, let's say 160 million lower middle class consumers into internet markets. It means that all internet businesses are going to function more productively and more profitably. At the same time, we can move towards interactive learning, and that we can measure the difference between those regions that have the benefits of meaningful broadband compared to other regions in the country that don't, and we can actually show the difference based on the methodologies of ethnography and anthropology and in neuroscience, showing that the meaningful impact actually can strengthen economies, strengthen cultures, and strengthen the confidence and empowerment of individual citizens. Now, these are citizens that include highly Islamic-oriented areas where fundamentalism competes with modernism and sometimes clashes. So we're very interested in bringing this meaningful broadband to the education of girls and women, and so that there's alternatives to the autocratic, paternalistic, and fundamentalist views that are sometimes promulgated in the countryside. So by bringing internet into the villages in this way, and even into the mosques and the Islamic boarding schools, we can see that there's a more progressive kind of Islam that may be possible, that will actually strengthen the religious cultures of those locations without promoting fundamentalism or some kind of conflict between their way of life and the modern way of life. In a sense, we're bringing the modern way of life to the villages on their own terms so that they can find their own empowerment through their own interactive use of internet on a government to consumer basis, government to government, government to business, and so forth. So essentially, we're creating what we call meaningful broadband ecosystems of interacting products and services that will work together to be usable, affordable, and empowering to the citizens.
So we're rolling, and 5, 4, 3.
Hello again. We left off with the notion that meaningful broadband means usable, affordable, and empowering, and that it represents a mix of products and services that get co-deployed at the base of the economy in these regions, and we have 7 test market regions. But I still need to explain the guidelines and the framework for how these ecosystems of products and services at a regional level are going to have a different impact than what we now see around the world when in other situations where the internet gets brought into developing nations. Well, let me explain that there's something called 5 domains of innovation within meaningful broadband, 5 different approaches to spreading technology and public policy and investments into the regions that are different from what has occurred in the West and in the advanced Asian nations like Singapore or the capital cities of other nations. This is a different approach because of the 5 domains of innovation. Let me explain these 5 domains. There's innovation in technology, like a new mix of technologies that need to be deployed, innovations in public policy, and that includes regulation and legal matters, such as intellectual property matters and so forth. And certain kinds of subsidies do need to be introduced from government budgets to make this happen. Number 3, there's a new kind of management. We have to introduce new ways the government functions through the use of new technology and the new ways the private sector can function through management. The 4th domain is ethics. Ethics refers to ways to encourage ethical behavior through regulation and through various incentives, through carrots and sticks. We want to discourage addictive behaviors and promote empowering behaviors. And there's mechanisms to do this in this 4th domain of ethics. The 5th domain is finance, financial ethics. We're introducing a concept called smart subsidy or market smart subsidy. So we are intervening into these test market regions by promoting different forms of regulation that encourage empowering impacts in these locations. Now, I'm going to go through these 5 one after another and explain how they're being introduced into Indonesia. And I'd also like to explain that this is being done with the full support of all the major technological universities in Indonesia, the University of Indonesia, for example, Institute Technology Bandung, which is like the MIT for this country. And it's being done with the help of the World Bank. The Washington, D.C. based intergovernmental agency has sent a team to work with myself and my group within the Digital Divide Institute and the other stakeholders that are shaping meaningful broadband in Indonesia. So there are teams being sent into the countryside to do field work and to activate the local governments towards these ecosystems of products and services. So the first one to talk about is the domain of technology. We have to consider what kind of technologies are needed to be introduced into the regions. We know that broadband technology needs to be introduced, but we need to find the right mix between mobile broadband that is given to consumers with cell towers, and then fixed fiber optic broadband is also needed. Those two forms of broadband have to be introduced. And then that creates a platform, a broadband-based platform to upgrade governments, to introduce something called cloud services, and to create a suite of applications that interact with the broadband to deliver a different kind of relationship between consumers and government. So we need a mix of technologies to be introduced, and that creates a precondition for moving forward with the other domains of technology.
So I am rolling, and 5, 4, 3.
Okay, welcome back. My name is Craig Warren Smith again, and I'm talking to you about meaningful broadband in Indonesia and explaining that we are moving forward to create meaningful broadband ecosystems in 7 test market regions throughout the Indonesian archipelago, and we're doing it with the World Bank and with other kinds of international and domestic partners. So we have 5 types of innovation that we're introducing. The first one is broadband technologies, and luckily in this nation there's a wonderful underground fiber optic network called the Palapa Ring that has been established that essentially brings high quality fiber optic cable throughout the entire spread of the archipelago. It's amazing. It's 17,000 miles of fiber optics spread underground through the nation. And that much of that is unused, so we have to deliver that technology at low cost and negotiate with the companies that control the use of that technology. And we also have to interact with the mobile carriers to make sure that the cell towers are adequate for 4G, 5G consumer broadband. So that's the technology side. Now I'd like to talk about the financial innovation that is being introduced along with the technological innovation. Like many nations, many democratic nations, Indonesia is not like China that creates big budgets and then creates big projects funded by the government. For example, in Australia, the government paid almost $50 billion for a national broadband network, a government-owned network, and then they expected the private sector to build on that, but private sector expected the government to pay for that network. And similarly, in China, the government essentially pays for all the infrastructure. In Indonesia, we're not using that approach. It's not a top-down financial model that we're working with, but there is a financial model, and it has a funny name. It's called USO times 8. USO stands for Universal Services Obligation. To be a member of the International Telecommunications Union, each nation needs to create a fund called Universal Services that will reinvest into the telecommunications sector to make it more equitable. So every nation has a USO fund, Universal Services Obligation Fund. So we have come up with a model of USO deployment that focuses on activating these meaningful broadband ecosystems by introducing this concept of smart subsidy. There's about $20 billion in the USO fund annually collected as a tax on telecommunications in that country. $20 billion isn't very much, but we've come up with the idea that we can interact with the private sector and government ministries in order to increase that financial platform on a ×8 basis. So $160 billion could be aggregated by working with the interests across all the various stakeholder groups. And that $160 billion annually will be enough to introduce this concept of smart subsidy so that we can then use that money to encourage investors in the private sector to enter markets that they would normally avoid because it could lower their costs and risks through this smart subsidy. Then we reinforce that smart subsidy with financial incentives, loan guarantees, regulations, IP arrangements, so that there's generally a lot of rewards that are given by government for companies that are willing to work at the low end of the market. And there's actually forms of punishment for companies that only exclusively work with the rich. So in some ways, we're getting the government regulators to reward foreign companies that are willing to use their expertise and investments to help the low-income sector. And in exchange for that, government will reward those companies by allowing them to pick the low-hanging fruit in the urban markets. So the Indonesian government, like so many governments, is in a period of economic nationalism where they only will allow companies to operate if they serve the national interest. So meaningful broadband provides a way to define what it means to help Indonesians and to serve the national interests. So this replaces a kind of free market ideology that simply promotes competition without any kind of ethical consideration. So this is definitely a post-deregulatory approach. It introduces what could be called market smart subsidies, so that maybe 10% of the costs and much of the risks of the private sector in entering low-income zones could be covered. And in this way, we can interest the billionaires of Indonesia and all their foreign partners to see the profit-making potential of entering these meaningful broadband ecosystems. So that's what we mean by financial innovations. To get more detail about that, you might look to digitaldivide.org for the economic and financial models that we're using to close the digital divide and essentially empower the low-income people of Indonesia.
I am rolling, and 5, 4, 3.
Hello again. My name is Craig Warren Smith, and we're talking about meaningful broadband, a framework for closing the digital divide, and its application and testing in the country of Indonesia. And as I was explaining in the earlier versions of this video series, there's 5 domains of innovation that are being delivered to 7 different test market locations distributed across the archipelago of Indonesia. Each location, each test market location, has about 500,000 people. So we're talking about a cadre of about 2.5 million people at the very base of the economy that is serving as a test market group for this larger group of 500 regions in a national population of almost 300 million. So potentially we're talking about testing a process on 2.5 million people that would ultimately be applied to 300 million people. At that point, we can operate at in economies of scale that will allow all the price points to drop and everything to be more affordable once we fine-tune this model with the 7 different regions. So as I was saying, we have 5 domains of innovation that need to be co-deployed at once. Some have to do with supply, some have to do with demand. They all interact to produce ecosystems, what we call meaningful broadband ecosystems. The 5 domains are: number 1, technology, finding the right mix of technologies. And I didn't mention this, but there's something called the late mover advantage that's relevant here. Unlike Western nations that have legacies of phone-based telecommunications, in a country like Indonesia, where nobody really has phones, they all have mobile phones, and they're using data services for all kinds of reasons. There's new kinds of technologies that can be introduced that don't require repeating the slow pace of the Western nations that began with telephone service. So we can think of moving 3D printing in, biometric use, bringing, changing healthcare, changing education, all these things. So the choices of technology are the first part of this model. The second part is public policy. As I mentioned earlier, that we have this concept called universal service obligation, where every nation has a fund that is specifically set up to distribute the benefits of telecommunications to the whole nation. So we have a financial model called USO times 8, where that $20 billion annually that's collected for the USO funds gets multiplied by 8 and then inserted into as subsidies, smart subsidies, into the meaningful broadband ecosystems so that they could function on a sustainable basis under different price points. That's the second domain of innovation. The third domain of innovations, which I'll talk to you about now, is management. These regional government units need to, and the nation at whole needs to move towards really smart, digitally based governance and management. There's a big challenge very much at the operational level about how you deliver the benefits of government and of the private sector through new forms of management. There's the term e-government that is sometimes used to refer to the conversion from digital to digital forms of governance. So Indonesia is well on its way towards converting to e-government. So we're looking at how e-government would work in these test market regions so that the department heads that oversee the government units, the schools, the healthcare systems, the cooperatives, and the local universities, they all share data between each other, and they're all hooked up to the same database, and they're all able then to interact with citizens that are themselves upgraded to 4G internet, so that you get a whole different kind of management functioning in these regions. Once that occurs, you can then send messages back up to Jakarta about how Jakarta ministries, there's 70 ministries in Jakarta, they need to change their management systems first, too, eventually, but they might want to look at how this management innovation functions in our test market ecosystems as a way of modeling what could occur for the nation at large. So management transformation, management systems are critical to all of this, and mostly it has to do with sharing data and the use of cloud services that go directly, that replace the servers at every level of the government, so that like a curriculum for the schools can move directly into the villages. It's all transparent. There's no corruption at different levels of government. It can all be tracked. And this could, the use of cloud services could introduce a whole new kind of management and governance in nations such as Indonesia. We're going to test how this could be done in meaningful broadband in our 7 different locations. So if you want to know more about the management aspect of meaningful broadband, you could look at our website, digitaldivide.org, that will break down the different ways in which management becomes overhauled in both public and private sectors as we move forward with meaningful broadband. So that's the third domain of innovations. Maybe we could stop here and just digest this before I move to the fourth domain of innovation, which is ethics.
Okay, I'm rolling, and 5, 4, 3.
Hello, welcome back. We're talking about meaningful broadband in Indonesia and the 5 domains of innovation that are being deployed in 7 different local regions to produce meaningful broadband ecosystems that are usable, affordable, and empowering to citizens. We've already talked about the technological domain of this and the domain of management. We've talked about the financial model for this. Now I want to talk about ethics, and related to that, I want to talk about public policy, how public policy and regulation has to change along with ethics. Now, what we mean by ethics is that we want to make sure that these regional units aren't licensing technology that would have an addictive impact on youth. We don't want to follow the path, say, of Korea, South Korea, where the internet was spread everywhere without any concern of ethics whatsoever. It resulted in the addiction of a whole generation of youth who are so addicted to gaming that they have to go to rehabilitation camps as if they were heroin abusers or something like that, because their dopamine is completely sucked out by their addictive use of technology. So Korea felt that somehow broadband was a good in and of itself without consideration of the ethical impacts of bringing it to everyone. That's not the way it's going to work in Indonesia. In Indonesia, they're going to introduce something in the Meaningful Broadband Framework called the Meaningful Technologies Index, which is a way of measuring the behavioral impact on any technology before it's licensed to operate in the nation. For example, if it's a game, if it's some kind of social media application, we want to be able to submit that application to testing to see if it can activate the motivation for learning and allow interactive learning and will awaken the natural curiosity of people rather than addict them. So by ranking technologies on a 1 to 10 scale, we can then negotiate with companies, encourage companies to bring in their empowerment-oriented technologies and to exclude some of their more addictive technologies. We also want technologies that are culturally relevant, that could be introduced into a village without disrupting patterns that might have existed for thousands of years in Indonesia. We want the values that are typical in villages to be enhanced, not eroded by modernism. We don't want to create conflict with the religious and cultural leaders of these locations. So in some cases, we'll use mosques and Islamic boarding schools as points of presence for internet-based learning. So we essentially want to work with the fabric of the ethical dimension of each location, but on top of everything, we want to make sure that we're using the measurement tools of neuroscience and of ethnography, which is a field of anthropology, to see if a given technology is addictive or not. So this all happens in the realm of regulation. For example, if you want spectrum licensing and you come in with a proposal to the government to get 4G or 5G spectrum, then you want to make sure that you come in with a plan for the meaningful use of that spectrum. That's the kind of thing. And there are many different kinds of regulations that can be incorporated into this in a public policy that is really encouraging meaningful broadband. So I want to just summarize now by saying there's 5 types of innovation that occur in the meaningful broadband model. There's technology, there's finance, there's management, there's ethics, and there's public policy and regulation. All of these 5 domains interact to enable meaningful broadband ecosystems to function at a financially self-sufficient basis, and then those can be spread laterally across the 500 regional units, and they can move horizontally up to Jakarta, where national policies can be shaped to enable meaningful broadband to spread nationally, so that by the year 2030, we feel that all 300 million Indonesians will have the empowering effect of meaningful broadband. If you have ideas about this, if you want to join us, please look to digitaldivide.org and join us, write us, and tell us how you would like to be part of this transformation. Now, putting this in a global frame, we know that all the factors that explain while the internet is creating more and more imbalance in the global economy, gaps between rich and poor, global warming, wealth accumulation, all these imbalances could be disrupted by meaningful broadband. We want to find one country that tests this approach, but by no means we will end there. There are dozens of countries around the world, in Asia, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, that could all benefit by the empowering impact of meaningful broadband, which is a concept that can lift all boats, that has no downside because it can help the business sector, it can help the academic sector, it can help the government sector, and create a more balanced and peaceful economy overall. Please join us. Thank you.